Hotel, welcome in, welcome in. Give me just a second to make sure I got everything set up correctly. I want everybody to be able to see and hear right. As y'all hit the link when you come in the building, make sure you hit that like button. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel. I appreciate it. It gets the algorithm going up. That makes the views go up. That makes the likes go up. The comments go up. It makes the channel do better. So I appreciate it. I appreciate you hitting the like button. And I appreciate you hitting that subscribe button. All right. And also make sure you hit that little notification bell so that you can be notified whenever I go live or whenever I drop another video. Okay. All right. Yeah, we got this thing set up right how it's supposed to be. All right, y'all see the title of this one. Today I'm going to be giving you guys some real good history. As always, I'm going to be going into the quote-unquote slave narratives or the oral history of our ancestors, and I'm going to be teaching y'all guys about an interesting figure named Dr. George Washington Buckner. Now, this individual led a very, very, very interesting life. He encountered some very interesting and prominent people, and the information that we can glean from his oral history or the records that were acquired by interviewing him is of immense importance. So today we're just going to be looking into some history. I'm going to be teaching you guys about another one of our ancestors who did some amazing things, and I believe his life story, how he came from slavery and became a doctor, educated himself, was educated at several institutions, became a doctor, practiced medicine, and also became an American ambassador to Liberia. I believe to learn about his story would be very, very, very inspirational. So as you guys can see, the image that we have is the actual picture of Dr. George Washington Buckner. Now, a lot of times whenever I go into these slave narratives, aka the oral history, we don't have the actual pictures of our ancestors or the ancestors that I'm talking about, but we're lucky enough that this ancestor, he rose to such prominence within the United States that we do have a picture of him. So without further ado, we're going to go into the history, and I'm going to break this thing down and tell you guys, hopefully, some things that you never heard before. Now, right off the bat, Dr. George Washington Buckner was born December the 1st, 1855 in Greensburg, Kentucky, and he died February the 17th, 1943 in Evansville, Indiana. And we're lucky that we do have his life story as told by himself in the oral histories of our ancestors. We can read it and we can see firsthand what he experienced, how he describes it, and how he describes going from being an enslaved individual to a doctor and to an American ambassador to Liberia. That's big, family. To go from a slave to an ambassador to a whole nother country, that's huge. Now, before we go into the slave narratives of Indiana, and before we read what he has to say in his own words, I wanted to just pull up some quick information off of Wikipedia to give you guys some basic background. Now, some of this background I just mentioned, but I'm going to give you guys some of the keynotes in his life, and we're going to go into the details about these keynotes in his life as we move forward. And as you can see, there is an entire Wikipedia page dedicated to this ancestor because, again, he rose to such prominence within the United States. His memory, his life is memorized, right? His memory has not been forgotten. But we have more information than just Wikipedia. But we see off the bat, it says George Washington Buckner, born December 1st, 1855, and died September 17th, 1943, was an American physician and diplomat. He was United States minister to Liberia from 1913 to 1915. Born into slavery near Greensburg, Kentucky, Buckner was freed at the age of 10. He attended a freedmen's school in Greensburg where he received a basic education. In 1870, he moved to Louisville, he moved to Louisville to live with his aunt and worked there briefly as a household servant before moving back to Greene County in 1871 to be a teacher. Buckner later moved to Indiana, where he was educated as a teacher at Indiana State Normal School in Terre Haute and as a doctor at the Indiana Eclectic Medical College. John W. Bowen, a prominent Evansville Democrat, brought Buckner to the attention of President Woodrow Wilson, who appointed him minister resident to Liberia in 1913. Buckner served in the post until 1915, during which time he also served as American Consul General in Monrovia, capital of Liberia. He died at the age of 87 in Evansville and is buried there in Oak Hill Cemetery. So we see that his story is found in the Indiana slave narratives, although he was born in Kentucky, because at some point he moved to Indiana. And when he was interviewed by the Federal Writers Project so that his story could be included in the archives of the slave narratives, he was living in Indiana. So let's get into his story. Okay, it says, this paper was prepared after several interviews had been obtained with the subject of this sketch. Dr. George Washington Buckner, tall, lean, white-haired, genial, and alert, answered the call of his doorbell. Although anxious to oblige the writer and willing to grant an interview, the life of a city doctor is filled with anxious solicitation for others, and he is always expecting a summons to the bedside of a patient or a professional interview has been slated. Dr. Buckner is no exception, and our interviews were often disturbed by the jingle of the doorbell or of a telephone call. Dr. Buckner's conversation lead in ever-widening circles away from the topic under discussion when the events of his own life were discussed. But he is a fluent speaker with a student of psychology. Psychology, as that philosophy relates to the mental and bodily tendencies of the African race, has long since become one of the major subjects with which this unusual man struggles. Why is the Negro? Is one of his deepest concerns. Give me just a second. Hold on. Okay. So first we see off the top that the interviewer came to see Dr. Buckner more than once, but since he was a actual practicing doctor in his in the town of Evansville, Indiana, at the time, the interviews were often cut short or interrupted by individuals calling him for, either trying to get him to do a follow-up on one of his previous patients, or to come see a patient that or to see a new patient that was suffering some type of an illness that they wanted him to work on. His telephone was always ringing, his doorbell was always going off. And not only was he a doctor in Evansville, Indiana, he was also deeply involved in politics, as we're going to see moving forward. So this guy was a mover and shaker in his area, and so it took several interviews to get all of the information out of him because they were interrupted quite often. Now, I highlighted this portion real quick because I think it goes to show some initial thought processes of the Dr. George Washington Buckner. Now, what you're going to see is this ancestor, he was an analytical thinker. Okay, his mind worked in a very particular way. And so they say that he often looked at the condition of his people from a philosophical perspective. And he concerned himself with the question of why is the Negro? Now, I believe that's an interesting way to say it, because he wasn't so much as interested in the particulars of how the Negro got into the position that he was in, or how the Negro could overcome, although he was interested in all of that stuff. That's not what they said. His philosophical questioning was, why is the Negro? And if you think about philosophy, a lot of times philosophy tries to understand the underlying purpose of a thing, the reasoning behind the physical aspect. Like science, regular natural science may study a tree, for instance, but the philosopher will contemplate, like, why does the tree even exist? What is the existential meaning or purpose or relevancy of the tree? How is the tree interconnected to everything else in existence? What is its true purpose? So when we see that one of his philosophical concerns was, why is the Negro, we can assume that Dr. George Washington Buckner was trying to say, what is the purpose? Right? What is the purpose of the Negro? We could even go deeper to assume that he was asking, what is the purpose for the Negro or the African American experiencing all that he had in this country? Was it some grand purpose? Is there some grand design behind it all? Is there a reason why his people was having to fight so hard to come out of the situation that was in? Is there some supernatural reasoning why they were put in the position that they were in? Why is the Negro? Why are things like they are? What is the purpose? Obviously, he was looking for some innate purpose in the existence of himself and the other members of his race. And when you think about it, that's a deep thing to meditate, and that's a deep thing to contemplate. We often think about what is our purpose as a human being. You know, what is the purpose of life? What is the meaning of life? Why are we here? Why do I go through the things that I go through? Why do I experience the things that I experience? But to contemplate that with an entire race of people takes some deep meditative thought that obviously the doctor was intellectual enough to engage in. It goes on to say, Dr. Buckner's first recollections center within a slave cabin in Kentucky. The cabin was the home of his stepfather, his invalid mother, and several children. The cabin was of the crudest construction, its only windows being merely holes in the cabin wall with crude bark shutters arranged to keep out snow and rain. The furnishings of this home consisted of a wood bedstead upon which a rough straw bed and patchwork quilts provided meager comforts for the invalid mother. A straw bed that could be pushed under the bedstead through the day was pulled into the middle of the cabin at night, and the wearied children were put to bed by the impatient stepfather. So we see a couple of things about his early life right off the bat. One of the main things, I want you to pay attention, it's going to come up later, but his father that lived with him was only a stepfather, was not his biological father, and his mother was an invalid. Now, if you don't know what an invalid means, that's basically saying that she was bedridden. She couldn't move, or she couldn't move around easily. So the majority of the time she just laid around in the bed, or if she could sit up, she sat up in some type of a chair. And so she had to have been cared for by her children and by her husband, Dr. Buckner's stepfather. So that in and of itself will be a very trying thing to endure. Now, his living situation was quite similar to the living situation of all of our ancestors throughout the southern states and any of the northern states that participated in slavery. The slave cabins were pretty much the same all the way throughout. And so we even see that inside of this particular house, they did have a bed, one bed, a straw bed, right? They didn't use cotton or feathers or the things that we use to make a mattress today. They a lot of times they use straw, right, or grass, or things that they found out in the woods to make it somewhat soft. And the children, obviously, they slept on some type of a pallet. He says that they had a bedstead that could be pushed underneath the straw bed during the day and pulled out in the middle of the night and just laid in the middle of the floor where the children could sleep. A lot of these homes, were just one bedroom homes. You know, you go inside, you have the bed here. If they have a table, a chair, you see that there. A lot of times they had some type of fireplace, but obviously he didn't have some type of fireplace, so I'm not sure exactly what the cooking situation looked like. But he had meager beginnings, just like a lot of our ancestors that were born in slavery. But he was living with his mother, and he was living with his stepfather inside of this cabin in Kentucky. And so he goes on to say, the parents, his stepfather and his invalid mother, the parents were slaves and served a master not wealthy enough to provide adequately for their comforts. The mother had become invalid through the task of bearing children each year and being deprived of medical and surgical attention. The master, Mr. Buckner, along with several of his relatives, had purchased a large tract of land in Greene County, Kentucky, and by a custom or tradition, as Dr. Buckner remembers, landowners that owned no slaves were considered poor white trash and were scarcely recognized as citizens within the state of Kentucky. So we see a little more information. Apparently, his mother had become invalid because through the task, he says, of bearing children each year without proper medical or surgical attention, just having them out in the cabin under unsterilized conditions, unsterilized medical instruments to cut the umbilical cord, to take care of her, clean her up, and to take care of the child. And this led to possibly infections, illness, disease, and it caused her to become an invalid. Now, this is kind of interesting too, because a lot of our ancestors back in those days had a lot of children, right? But what you're going to see as we move forward, this may have even been a breeding situation where they were trying to use his mother as a breeder to produce more children so that they could eventually have more slaves. The slave owner could have more slaves, right? Because you see that his stepfather was not his biological father. So it's going to lean to the question of who was his biological father. Now, later on in the narrative, he's going to describe himself as a mulatto. Now, mulatto is someone of mixed parentage, right? They're one of the parents is white, one of the parents is black, or one of the parents is Indian, one of the parents is white, or one of the parents is Indian, one of the parents are black. But most of the time, the father was white, the mother was black, and that's how you would have a mulatto. And even when you look into his name, George Washington Buckner, the fact that they named him George Washington and named him clearly after the first president of the United States, George Washington, one can assume that that naming came from a white father. You understand what I'm saying? But we're going to look into that a little bit further. But it's possible that his mother was an invalid because she was being used to breed more children so that whoever owned her could have more slaves. Let's go a little further. He says, another tradition prevailed that slave children should be presented to the master's young sons and daughters and become their special property even in childhood. Adhering to that tradition, the child, George Washington Buckner, became the slave of a young Morris Dickey Buckner, and although the two children were nearly the same age, the little mulatto boy, there it is, the little mulatto boy was obedient to the wishes of his little master. Indeed, the slave child cared for the Caucasian boy's clothing, polished his boots, put away his toys, and was his playmate and companion as well as his slave. Now, one of the things that happened a lot in slavery, when the enslaved children were young, they weren't put out into the fields to do the physical manual labor of the adults. A lot of times they had, a lot of times they were allowed to just play around and rip and run and do small jobs or take care of the house, help clean up the house, run errands here and there, help the master or master's children put on their shoes and whatnot. And if the owner, if the slave master had children, then the children slaves would often become like dare I say, the property of, or the living toys of the slave master's children, and they would use them you know, in any way that they liked. A lot of times they would use them as playmates or play buddies. A lot of times when you look into these slave narratives or these old histories, and an individual talks about their childhood as a slave, a lot of times they're going to tell you that, oh, when they was a child, they played in the big house with the master's children. They were used for the entertainment of these slave masters' children, and a lot of times they form bonds with the slave masters' children, but those bonds did not really supersede the societal structuring. Like those the slave masters' children never really slave children as his equal, although they got pretty close and they were friends and they hung out and they played a lot. It was always an understanding of that societal hierarchy that was always implanted into their mind. And so ancestor Dr. George Washington Buckner was no exception. The slave master that owned his family had a young son named Morris Dickey Buckner. And Morris is short for master. They had to call the slave master's children master and Mrs. The boys master, the females Mrs. Okay. And so these two bonded on a certain level while he played with the master's son while the master was young. This was a common practice during our ancestors' enslavement. He goes on to say, sickness and suffering and even death visits alike the just and the unjust, and the loving, sympathetic slave boy witnessed the suffering and death of his little white friend. Then grief took possession of the little slave. He could not bear the sight of little Dick's toys, nor books, not clothing. He recalls one harrowing experience after the death of little Dick Buckner. George's grandmother was a housekeeper and kitchen maid for the white family. She was in the kitchen one late afternoon preparing the evening meal. The master had taken his family for a visit in the neighborhood, and the mulatto child sat on the veranda and recalled pleasanter days. A sudden desire seized him to look into the bedroom where little Morris Dickey had lain in bed. The evening shadows had fallen, exaggerated by the influence of trees and vines, and when he placed his pale face near the window pane, he thought it was the face of little Dickey looking out at him. His nerves gave away, and he ran around the house, screaming to his grandmother that he had seen Dickey's ghost. The old colored woman was sympathetic, dried his tears, then, with tears coursing down her own cheeks, she went about her duties. George firmly believed he had seen a ghost, and never really convinced himself against the idea until he had reached the years of manhood. He remembers how the story reached the ears of the other slaves, and they were terrorized at the suggestion of a ghost being in the master's home. That is the way superstitions always started, said the doctor. Some nervous persons received a wrong impression, and there were always others ready to embrace the error. Now, during those days, people died young a lot. A lot of children died in childbirth. Parents died in childbirth, and infant mortality rate was high. And a lot of children didn't even live to see 10 or 12 years old. And so, as a case in point in this, the master's son, Morris Dickey Buckner, he fell ill as a child, and he died as well. And subsequently, one day, the doctor saw a face in the window, or what he assumed to be a face, and he thought it was the ghost of his childhood friend, Dickey Buckner. And he, ran and told his grandmother. He cried, told some of the other slaves in the, some of the other slaves that were in the area heard this. And apparently this became a ghost story that, okay, the master's home was haunted by his son. Now, our ancestors definitely believed in ghosts. You hear about ghosts in a lot of these slave narratives. So the belief in ghosts, the belief in haunts, the belief in haunted places is real. Now, I did a video that you will find on my page where I'm talking about plantation ghost stories, and I showed some pretty compelling evidence that some of the phenomena that were described as hauntings by our ancestors on some of these plantations have a lot of ring of truth to them. So if you're interested in that topic, you can find that video. But let's go a little further with the narrative. Dr. Buckner remembers that when a young daughter of his master married, his sister was given to her for a bridal gift and went away from her own mother to live in the young mistress's new home. So not only was when our ancestors were children, they were sort of handed over to the children of the slave owner to be their playmates. But when the children of the slave owner got married, be it the male, a son or a daughter, whenever they got married, a lot their parents owned a number of slaves, they would allow their child to pick one of the enslaved individuals to take with them to their new home, so that they can start their life together with the slave of their choosing, rather. And our ancestor experienced this as well. He says, it always filled us with sorrow when we were separated, either by circumstances or of marriage or death. Although we were not properly housed, properly nourished, nor properly clothed, we loved each other and loved our cabin homes, and were unhappy when compelled to part. There are many beautiful spots near the Green River, and our home was situated near Greensburg, the county seat of Dreen County. The area occupied by Mr. Buckner and his relatives is located near the river, and the meanderings of the stream almost formed a peninsula covered with rich soil. Buckner's Hill relieved the landscape, and clear springs bubbled through crevices, affording much water for household use, and near those springs, white and Negro children met to enjoy themselves. Now, basically what he's talking about is the area where he was enslaved in. A large swath of land, many acres, was purchased by the Buckner family, and several individuals with that Buckner name lived in this area and occupied this area. Buckner was a prominent name back in the day. There were there were several political figures who came from the Buckner household. You know, they had money, they had prestige, they held political offices, they was fighting in the wars, and the Buckner name was it was how can I say, prominent. I guess is the best word for it. It was prominent, and I'm even of the opinion that I kind of believe that the individual Buckner that owned his mother quite possibly was his father. Remember, he said that he lived with his mother and his stepfather, and he was a mulatto. So his father was most likely white and was not around. And a lot of times when you had those mulattoes on particular plantations, and they had names like he has, George Washington Buckner, a lot of times the slave owner was the actual father. But if your mother was a slave, irregardless of who your father was, you were a slave as well. Now, the image on the left is an actual house that was owned by A-Let Buckner in antebellum days during slavery. Antebellum days is like before the end of the Civil War, when slavery was still totally legal. And A-Let Buckner is a member of this Buckner family that I'm telling you about. Now, that's not the actual Buckner that owned him, and I couldn't find their house. I couldn't find their actual plantation, but this is actually a Buckner house that was in the area that he is describing, where Mr. Buckner and his relatives actually lived. This is actually one of the houses that he would have seen and been around growing up. He goes on to say, 40 years after I left Greensburg, I went back to visit the springs and tried to meet my old friends. The friends had passed away. Only a few merchants and salespeople remembered my ancestors. Now, I thought that was a key term to use. You see that, so he says he goes back and he says the friends that he had there, they was all passed away. And only a few merchants and salespeople remembered my ancestors. Now, he could very well be talking about his ancestors who were enslaved, or since he was a mulatto, he could be talking about his ancestors that came from a white lineage, right? He could actually be talking about the Buckners as his ancestors, right? Listen, he says a story told by Dr. Buckner relates an evening at the beginning of the Civil War. I had heard my parents talk of the war, but it did not seem real to me until one night when mother came to the pallet where we slept and called to us to get up and tell our uncles goodbye. Then 4 startled little children arose. Mother was standing in the room with a candle or a sort of torch made from grease drippings and old pieces of cloth. These rude candles were in common use and afforded but poor light. And there stood her 4 brothers, Jacob, John, Bill, and Isaac, all with the light of adventure shining upon their mulatto countenances. Stop right there. So his mother's 4 brothers, Jacob, John, Bill, and Isaac, they were all mulattoes too, meaning that one of their parents was black and most likely one of their parents was white, which is why I'm believing that these Buckners, right, the slave owning Buckners family was having a lot of children on this plantation, right? He goes on to say, they were starting a way to fight for their liberties, and we were greatly impressed. So what we're seeing here is kind of a powerful point in American history that our ancestors were there for, and especially the one that we're talking about right now today. Even though he was a child when the Civil War took place, 4 of his uncles were trying to actually sign up to fight in the American Civil War. And you can tell by how he says they were starting a way to fight for their liberties and were greatly impressed. They were trying to fight for the side of the Union as opposed to the side of the Confederacy. One thing about the states during the Civil War, yes, a majority of the southern states immediately joined the Confederacy, right? The northern states immediately joined the Union. And how we understand the Civil War is we had the northern states versus the southern states. We had the Union Army versus the Confederate Army. Well, there were some states that were technically kind of considered to be southern states who were undecided, right? Undecided on which side that they were actually going to be on when the war first started, because they had a segment of the population that was pro-slavery and a segment of the population that was against slavery. And so there was no clear way for them to swing. Kentucky, the state that our ancestor was in, happened to be one of these states that kind of went through both hands during the Civil War. But we can see that at this moment in Kentucky, his uncles were trying to go and join the Union Army to fight for their liberties. Real quick, when you look up Kentucky in the American Civil War, it'll tell you that Kentucky was a southern border state of key importance in the American Civil War. It officially declared its neutrality at the beginning of the war, but after a failed attempt by Confederate General Leonidas Polk to take the state of Kentucky for the Confederacy, the legislature petitioned the Union Army for assistance. Though the Confederacy controlled more than half of Kentucky early in the war, after early 1862, Kentucky came largely under U.S. control. In the historiography of the Civil War, Kentucky is treated primarily as a southern border state with special attention to the social divisions during the secession crisis, invasions and raids, internal violence, sporadic guerrilla warfare, federal-state relations, the ending of slavery, and the return of Confederate veterans. So Kentucky was a key player in the American Civil War. They go on to say that Kentucky was the birthplace of Abraham Lincoln, his wife, Mary Todd, and his southern counterpart, Confederate President Jefferson Davis. So both the presidents at the time, the president of the Union and the president of the Confederacy, were both from Kentucky. They say that Lincoln had declared early in the war, I think to lose Kentucky is nearly the same as to lose the whole game. 35,000 Kentuckians served as Confederate soldiers. An estimated 125,000 Kentuckians served as Union soldiers. Approximately 25,000 Black Kentuckians, free and enslaved, served as Union soldiers. So we see that in Kentucky, they lended around 35,000 of their citizens joined the Confederate Army. 125,000 joined the Union Army, and around 25,000 blacks in Kentucky joined the Union Army. So about as many of the white citizens that joined the Confederacy, you had the black citizens that joined the Union Army. And out of these 24,000 black Kentuckians, free and enslaved, that served as Union soldiers, we see that some of the ancestors' uncles was actually part of that number. He was right there in the thick of it. Now, what I did, I wanted to post you guys. I wanted to show you guys. If you look at the image on the right, I wanted to show you guys an actual advertisement from October 9th, 1862, where you can see that overall the Kentuckians were divided on which side the state was going to actually go with, and you can see them trying to persuade the citizens of Kentucky to fully and totally join the Confederacy. The advertisement says, Kentuckians, the time for hesitation has passed. You have now to fight either for the Yankees, who will press you into their service, or for your homes, your firesides, your property, and your liberty. With your brethren of the South, who will put in force very speedily the conscript law, one side or the other you must take. For my part, my choice is made. But we know that whoever decided to join the Union, they eventually were victorious. Okay. Excuse me, the narrative goes on to say, Dr. Buckner stated that officials thought Jacob entirely too aged to enter the service, as he had a few scattered white hairs, but he remembers he was brawny and unafraid. Isaac was too young, but the other two uncles were accepted. So Isaac was too young, Jacob was too old, but John and Bill was actually of the right age. And so he says, one never returned because he was killed in battle, but one fought throughout the war and was never wounded. So the ancestor, Dr. George Washington Buckner, he also has an uncle that was killed in the Civil War, and he has one that fought throughout the entire war, fought bravely, was never even wounded, and came back a hero. So we honor those two ancestors as well, the uncles of Dr. George Washington Buckner. We honor them for the sacrifices that they made. He remembers how the white men were indignant because the Negroes were allowed to enlist, and how Marsh Stanton Buckner was forced to hide out in the woods for many months because he had met slave Frank Buckner and had tried to kill him. Frank returned to Greensburg, forgave his master, and procured a paper stating that he was at fault, after which Stanton returned to active service. Yes, the road has been long. Memory brings back those days, and the love of my mother is still real to me. God bless her. Now, this is interesting because, okay, now we know the actual name of the man that owned George Washington Buckner's family, Stanton Buckner. Now, they're saying that when the Civil War kicked off, immediately things changed. Things changed for our ancestors, the African American population. He says that Marsh Stanton Buckner, the slave owner, the white man, was forced to hide in the woods for many months because he met a slave, Frank Buckner, and he tried to kill him. So because he tried to kill him, he had to hide out. And the only way for him to come back and be accepted again without being prosecuted to the full extent of the law is the slave, Frank, had to come to Greensburg, forgive him for trying to kill him, and basically write up a paper saying, you know what, it was my fault, everything that happened, don't hold it to his charge. And with those papers, he was able to return back to active service in the Union Army. Look, he goes on to say, relating to the value of an education, Dr. Buckner hopes every Caucasian and Afro-American youth and maiden will strive to attain great heights. His first efforts to procure knowledge consisted of reciting ABS's, now it's probably meant to be ABCs, from the McGuffey's blue-back speller with his unlettered sister for a teacher. Now, I took the liberty of putting a picture of McGuffey's eclectic spelling book on the screen so you could kind of see when the ancestor said that his first efforts to procure knowledge was with McGuffey's blue-backed speller. This is McGuffey's blue-back speller. So this is actually like the booklet that our ancestor was using to get his first piece of knowledge, his first piece of learning that would eventually lead him into a career as a doctor and propel him into being an ambassador to Liberia, Africa. Look, the McGuffey's Eclectic Spelling Book, also known as the Blue-Backed Speller, also known as the Blue-Backed Speller, what did the ancestor say? His first efforts to procure knowledge consisted of reciting ABCs from the McGuffey's Blue-Backed Speller, okay, just to show you that this is what he's talking about. The McGuffey's Eclectic Spelling Book, also known as the Blue-Backed Speller, holds a significant place in American educational history. Created by Alexander Hamilton McGuffey in 1846, this speller was widely used to teach children how to read, spell, and pronounce words. Its blue cover earned it the nickname Blue-Backed Speller. For over a century, this book remained immensely popular and was the first to be published in substantial numbers in the United States. Now, our ancestor that we're covering right now, he isn't the only one that used this book. So, just for a point of history, historical relevance, if you hear the name Blue-Backed Speller, McGuffey's Eclectic Spelling Book, this is what they're talking about. He goes on to say, in later years, he attended a school conducted by the Freedmen Association. Now, that is like the Freedmen Bureau, an institution created by the government made up of newly freed African Americans or the Negro population after the end of the Civil War that were totally concerned with helping the Negro population, the African American population, level the playing field, get their education, get homes, learn about the right to vote, teach their children, to basically raise them up, help them out. The Freedmen Bureau or the Freedmen Association was concerned with the upliftment of the free men, right? The free men, the individuals who have been freed with the advent of the Civil War. He goes on to say he bought a grammar from a white schoolboy and studied it at home. When 16 years of age, he was employed to teach Negro children and grieves to recall how limited his ability was bound to have been. When a father considers sending his son or daughter to school today, he orders catalogs, consults his friends, and considers the location and surroundings and the advice of those who have patronized the different schools. He finally decides upon the school that promises the boy or girl the most attractive and comfortable surroundings. Now, I highlighted that because our ancestors, fresh out of slavery, held education high. They held education in high regard, and they took education seriously. And they did everything they could to get their children the best types of education that their lot in life could afford them to give. How he says, even some parents, if they had the means, they would do a lot of research before they chose the school to send their children to, because they wanted the best type of education for their children, because they realized that proper education, information, knowledge would be the determining factor of how high they would be able to raise themselves up in society. One of the things when you read a lot of our ancestors, we're keenly aware of the fact that a lack of education, a lack of being able to read and write and understand about the world, a key component and keep them enslaved, right? It's hard to enslave and perpetually enslave a group of people who have and information at their fingertips, because it's something about the acquiring of knowledge that they say, Frederick Douglass said, makes one unfit to be a slave. And the slave owners, they knew this. That's why it was illegal for our ancestors to read. They didn't want you to learn how to read and write. They didn't want you to have any type of education. They didn't want you to get any type of knowledge, and you could be punished for trying to learn how to read and write and gain knowledge, because they knew that once you gain knowledge, it would be impossible to keep you enslaved perpetually. So one of the things that goes hand in hand with the perpetual enslavement of a people is to keep them ignorant. And when our ancestors got free, they knew that. They understood that their ignorant state was a negative. And so they took education very seriously, because they knew that education would take them from one level to the next, which is one thing I honor the people who still understand that and hold on to that train of thought, and who promote that train of thought. And I just wish more people would understand that education could take you from one level to the next. Look, he goes on to say, when I taught the African children, I boarded with an old man whose cabin was filled with his own family. I climbed a ladder leading from the cabin into a dark, uncomfortable loft where a comfort and a straw bed were my only conveniences. Leaving Greensburg, the young mulatto, there it is again, made his way to Indianapolis, where he became acquainted with the first educated Negro he had ever met. The Negro was Robert Bruce Bagby, then principal of the only school for Negroes in Indianapolis. The same old building is standing there today that housed Bagby's institution then, he declares. Now, before I continue, Robert Bruce Bagby is another name that is of historical relevance to our ancestor story. Now, real quick, check this out. Born in 1847, Robert Bagby was the son of former slaves. His father purchased his freedom, and his former master, a tanner, taught him his trade and later partnered with him in business. After graduating Oberlin College, Robert relocated to Indianapolis in the early 1870s, where he began principal of the all-black public school. Right? Shortly after he arrived, his brothers, Benjamin D. Bagby and James D. Bagby, followed his lead. They too moved to Indianapolis and became principals of all black schools. Although they were primarily educators, the Bagby brothers decided to start a 4-page weekly newspaper in 1879, the Indianapolis Leader. It became the first black newspaper in Indianapolis. And the picture on the left is a copy of the Indianapolis Leader, the first black newspaper in Indianapolis, and it was started by Robert Bagby and his brothers. And this is the same Robert Bagby that our ancestor had the pleasure of meeting when he made his way to Indianapolis. And so again, in the time period after our ancestors' enslavement, there were movers and shakers everywhere. He says, Dr. Buckner recalls that when he left Bagby School, he was so low financially, he had to procure a position in a private residence as a houseboy. This position was followed by many jobs of serving tables at hotels and eating houses of any and all kinds. While engaged in that work, he met Colonel Albert Johnson and his lovely wife, both natives of Arkansas, and he remembers their congratulations when they learned that he was striving for an education. They advised his entering an educational institute at Terre Haute. His desire had been to enter that institute of normal training, but felt doubtful of succeeding in the advanced courses because its advantages had been so limited. Wait, check this out. Now, right here, we're talking about the advisors entering, and again, why I take time to stop to show you guys this type of stuff. Why I'm showing you Robert Bagby and the newspaper that he started. Why did I show you the Blueback Speller? Why am I showing you the Indiana State Normal School right now? It is because at certain points in the oral history, our ancestors mention things that I like to take the time out to verify historically, so that an individual can get a grasp of just how historically relevant these oral histories or slave narratives are. to spark something in your brain to go and research this information for yourself, because the things that you will read, it's like the real history of what our ancestors went through from their own words. Right? It's one thing to read what somebody else says about what our ancestors went through. It's a total different thing to read what they have to say themselves. And so I like to take the time to verify what they're saying, so you know that you can trust this oral history. So you see how he says they advised his entering an educational institute at Terre Haute. His desire had been to enter that institute of normal training, but felt doubtful of succeeding in the advanced courses. Now, this is a picture, a drawn picture, obviously, of the Indiana State Normal School in 1903. This is the university that the ancestor is talking about enrolling in and joining. So the schools that he says he attended are real. He attended them. The people that he said he met are real. He actually met them. They were movers and shakers. And everything that the ancestor is telling us is 100% correct. Look, he says, but Miss Johnson told him that God gives his talents to different species, and he would love and protect the Negro boy. After studying several years at the Terre Haute State Normal, George W. Buckner felt assured that he was reasonably prepared to teach the Negro youths, and accepted the professorship of schools at Vincennes, Washington, and other Indiana villages. So we see that the more he learns, he begins teaching. He first started teaching at the age of 16, but he didn't have a lot of knowledge, but he was teaching what he knew. And as he gained more information, he was able to teach on a higher level, so to speak. So, each one teach one. The more you learn, the more you share. The more you learn, the more you share. Our ancestor epitomized this. And every time he went up a level in educational knowledge, he began to teach that knowledge that he had acquired, which my hats off to him for that. Look, he goes on to say, I was interested in the young people and anxious for their advancement, but the suffering endured by my invalid mother, who had passed into the great beyond, and the memory of little Master Dickey's lingering illness and untimely death would not desert my consciousness. I determined to take up the study of medical practice and surgery, which I did. So at this point, the ancestor's life takes a detour. He's moving in the direction of being an educator. He's gaining more and more information, more and more education, and he's leaning more towards teaching. He's teaching the youth what he knows. He's learning more. He's teaching the youth more of what he knows. But at this point, he makes the decision that instead of just being a teacher, he actually wants to go into the field of a physician. And his primary reasonings for that is because of his invalid mother, which we talked about earlier, and young Morris Dickey Buckner, his childhood friend, who got ill and died when he was young. And so both of these instances left an impression on Dr. George Washington Buckner's life, to where he wanted to be able to heal sickness, heal illness, and do for others what he could not do for his mother and what he could not do for Morris Dickey. And so he goes on to say that Dr. Buckner graduated from the Indiana Eclectic Medical College in 1890. His services were needed at Indianapolis, so he practiced medicine in that city for a year, then located at Evansville, where he has enjoyed an ever-increasing popularity on account of his sympathetic attitude among his people. So he practiced medicine in Indianapolis, right? In Indianapolis for a year, and then he relocated to Evansville, where the interview actually took place and where he subsequently died. But right here, it gives us some type of a glimpse into what type of doctor he was, because that's important. It says that he graduated from the Indiana, it says eclectic, but that's eclectic Medical College. So what you want to do, you want to ask yourself, what is the Indiana Eclectic Medical College? What type of medicine did they practice? right? What type was he? Was he a heart doctor? Was he a brain doctor, a brain surgeon, or a heart surgeon? Did he work with the nervous system? Did he work with the lungs? Did he work with the skeleton? Did he work with the respiratory system? What type of doctor was he? And look, check this out. Eclectic medicine. Eclectic medicine was a branch of American medicine. They made use of botanical remedies along with other substances and physical therapy practices popular in the later half of the 19th and first half of the 20th centuries. The term was coined by Constantine Samuel Raphaelynx, a botanist and Transylvanian University professor who had studied Native American use of medicinal plants, wrote and lectured extensively on herbal medicine, and advised patients and sold remedies by mail. Eclectic medicine appeared as an extension of early American herbal medicine traditions, such as Thompsonian medicine in the early 19th century, and included Native American medicine. Standard medical practices at the time made extensive use of purges with calomel and other mercury-based remedies, as well as extensive bloodletting. Now, not to take anything away from our ancestors' degrees as a doctor, but mercury is very poisonous, very, very poisonous. Hold on, give me just a second. Anthem Animus, thanks for sharing the information that you do. No doubt, man. Thank you for tapping in. Just trying to, put all this on the record and, teach our history from the perspective of our ancestors themselves. I want to put all this information out. So this channel will be the premier channel for learning about our history from the words of our ancestors themselves. Thanks for tapping in. But what's interesting to me about this is that eclectic medicine, the medical practice that our ancestors learned, it involved Native American knowledge on medicinal plants. And when I read that, it instantly made me think about, because I've been doing videos about it, about the hoodoo doctors and the conjure doctors and the root workers. Even when you look at the African American side, and not just from the Native American understanding, from the Negro American or the African American understanding, they also used roots and plants and things that you could find out in the woods to perform medical healing and to treat illnesses and sicknesses and disease, right? And on the one hand, that was known as superstition. Hoodoo, conjure, root work was known as superstition. But at one point, this eclectic medicine, which used the Native American knowledge of medicinal plants, was an actual medical field, and you could be a respected doctor with doctor on your name with that particular knowledge of herbal plants and herbal remedies. Even now, like naturopathic medicine is kind of looked down on and shunned upon. I thought that was very interesting. Now, full disclosure, even eclectic medicine was eventually outlawed, but at this time, when hoodoo and conjure and root work was superstition, this was a legitimate branch of medical science. And honestly speaking, all medicine really comes from plants, right? Now we have a lot of processed stuff. We have a lot of chemicals that we make our medicines and our remedies out of, the things that you can find at the drugstore. But for millions of years, like what did humans use? They use the stuff that grew naturally. Obviously, that's the basis of all medicine. Plants, herbs, roots. That's the basis of all medicine right there. That's the most pure form of medicine you can get. Think about animals. Animals have no drugstore. What do they do when they get sick? Yeah, sometimes they may get sick and die, but what do they use? They use the things that are grown in nature around them. So the ancestor, when he said that he graduated from the Indiana Eclectic Medical College in 1890, his doctorate degree, him being a doctor, was in eclectic medicine, meaning he studied the use of plants and herbal remedies majorly. That was his field. Look, he goes on to say, when I came to Evansville, says Dr. Buckner, there were 70 white physicians practicing in the area. They are now among the departed. Their task was strenuous. Roads were almost impossible to travel, and those brave men soon sacrificed their lives for the good of suffering humanity. Dr. Buckner described several of the old doctors as striding a horse and setting out through all kinds of weather. Again, most of these doctors, they had to do house calls. They didn't have a lot of huge hospitals where individual could just get in an ambulance or get in their car and drive to the hospital. A lot of times, if an individual fell sick and after a couple of days, they didn't just get better, and after using home remedies, they didn't just get better, someone would contact the doctor would make a house call. When you think about these old TV shows and old movies, you will see doctors showing up to people's homes with their doctor bag, the big black suitcase or whatever. They go inside, they talk to the person, they open up their briefcase, and they start trying to perform an examination to figure out what's wrong and to offer some type of solution. So that's why Dr. Buckner describes several of the old doctors as striding a horse and setting out through all kinds of. Look, he says, Dr. Buckner is a veritable encyclopedia of war. He stops at many points during an interview to relate stories he has gleaned here and there. He has forgotten where he first heard this one or that one, but it helps to illustrate a point. One he heard near the end of the war follows, and although it has recently been retold, it holds the interest of the listener. Now, a lot of times when they talk about the Negro lore, people assume that these are just stories that the African Americans made up, the Negroes made up. Well, I'm going to show you this one story that's entered into this oral history or this quote unquote slave narrative, and we're going to look to see if we can verify the authenticity of it. It's going to be interesting. He says, Andrew Jackson, that's President Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson owned an old Negro slave who stayed on at the old home when his beloved master went into politics. He became an American soldier and statesman, and finally the 7th president of the United States. The good slave still remained through the several years of the quiet, uneventful last years of his master and witnessed his death, which occurred at his home near Nashville, Tennessee. After the master had been placed under the sod, Uncle Sammy was seen each day visiting Jackson's grave. Do you think President Jackson is in heaven? An acquaintance asked Uncle Sammy. If he wanted to go there, he dare now, said the old man. If Morris Andy wanted to do anything, all hell couldn't keep him from doing it. And Morris Andy is Morris Andrew Jackson. Now, President Andrew Jackson, obviously the 7th president of the United States, and he was in office from March 4th, 1829 to March 4th, 1837. Now, what's interesting about this, I once did a video where I was talking about presidential slave owners, and it was only part 1, but I haven't took the time to do part 2. Maybe I will now. But I highlighted George Washington, the first president, and I highlighted Thomas Jefferson, the primary writer of the Declaration of Independence. Both of these men, one fighting in the Revolutionary War, one the primary writer for the Declaration of Independence, both were slave owners. And the majority of presidents of the United States prior to Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War owned slaves. Okay, the presidents themselves, which I always found funny when people talking about taking down the statues of the Confederates, the Confederate generals, and the president, the only one president of the Confederate Army. People talking about taking down their statues and whatnot. And in my mind, I was thinking, you want to take down the statues of the Confederate generals for being pro-slavery, but right there on Mount Rushmore, you got George Washington. He owned slaves, and he came from a slave-owning family. The people on the money, Andrew Jackson, he owned a $20 bill. The man owned slaves. So if you want to take down the Confederate statues, you should have wanted to take his face off the $20 bill as well. something to consider. It was not just the Confederates that were pro-slavery. Okay? It was not just the Confederates that were pro-slavery. And so if you want to get rid of statues to individuals that was pro-slavery, you're going to have to dig into a lot of these presidents' background that was prior to the Civil War, because the majority of them did. Even the ones that we think were good, like, again, Thomas Jefferson. Okay? But look, check this out. The story that he told was of a slave named that he calls Uncle Sammy, who was a slave to President Andrew Jackson and was enslaved by him. When President Andrew Jackson actually went to the White House to assume the role of the president of the United States, he stayed back. He was there when the president died, and he visited his grave, right? Now, an individual may try to say that, okay, is that just like a good story, a fanciful tale? Is it folklore? Or is there any type of truth to the statement? Is Uncle Sammy even a real person? Let me show you guys something. Now, this is real interesting. Now, when Andrew Jackson left his home, his plantation, he owned slaves, plenty of them. When he left his plantation to go become the president of the United States, his farm, Hermitage, a slave plantation, they made a list of the names and ages of the individuals that was enslaved by Andrew Jackson at his farm, Hermitage, or his plantation. And so we actually have the list. We actually have the list. And so the image on the left of your screen, that is the list of slaves with their names and ages that were on the farm or on the plantation when Andrew Jackson left to go become the president. Now, we're going to have to zoom in on this to really see what it is. So on the right, I zoomed in on the top portion of the document. Now, the highlighted portion is in cursive, and so I wrote out what it says on the top. You can read along. It says, the names and ages of the Negroes on Andrew Jackson's farm, Hermitage, this 5th of January, 1829. So this is January 1829. Now remember, President Andrew Jackson was in office March 4th, 1829. So in preparation to go assume the presidency, they made a list of his property, his financial holdings, which included the slaves on the Hermitage plantation. And so that's why this is the names and ages of the Negroes, you see that, on Andrew Jackson's farm, Hermitage, this 5th of January, 1829. You see that? 1829. So this is the actual document itself that was created. So what we're going to do, we're going to go through that list. And when we look at a list of names and ages, look what we see, family. I highlighted it for you. You see that? Sam, 12. Sam, 12. Sam, 12. Now, this is in 1829. He was 12 years old. So by the time they're interviewing Dr. George Washington Buckner, Sam, or who he calls Uncle Sammy, would have indeed been an old Negro that he talked about in the story. You see? He says, look, Andrew Jackson owned an old Negro slave. Now, he wasn't old when Andrew Jackson owned him. He was old when the story was being told. Andrew Jackson owned an old Negro slave who stayed on at home when his beloved master went into politics, became an American soldier and statesman, and finally the 7th president of the United States. The good slave still remained through the several years of the quiet, uneventful last years of his master and witnessed his death. which occurred at his home near Nashville, Tennessee. After the master had been placed under the sod, Uncle Sammy was seen each day visiting Jackson's grave. Do you think President Jackson is in heaven? An acquaintance asked Uncle Sammy. If and he wanted to go there, he dared now, said the old man. Now he's an old man talking about the deceased President Jackson. President Jackson died, I think, in 1949 or something like that. So this is after he's dead, he's the old man. He isn't the old man when he becomes the president, okay? If and Marse Andy wanted to do anything, all hell couldn't keep him from doing it. And so it's interesting to see that the ancestor talked about Uncle Sammy being enslaved to President Jackson. And when we look on the listings of slaves that President Andrew Jackson had, we do see an individual in 1829 who's 12 years of age named Sam. Right? So that, I guess, we can say that the ancestor was telling the truth. Let's go further. Dr. Buckner believes each Negro is confident that he will take himself with all his peculiarities to the land of promise. Each physical feature and habitual idiosyncrasy will abide in his redeemed personality. Old Joe will be there in person, with the wrinkle crossing the bridge of his nose, and little Stephen will wear his wool pulled back from his eyes, and each will recognize his fellow man. What fools we all are, declared Dr. Buckner. So Dr. Buckner is saying that he doesn't particularly believe this. He's a different type of thinker, but he gives us some insight into what our ancestors, as he understood it, believed about the afterlife. Right? He's saying that our ancestors fully believed in the afterlife, that they would go somewhere to the land of promise after they died, and they would appear in the exact same form as they appeared on earth. The old man would still have the wrinkles on his nose, and the individuals that died young would still be young, vibrant, full of life, wearing the things that they wore on earth. So the land of promise, the afterlife, heaven, as our ancestors saw it, was you will look how you look now, and everybody will be able to recognize one another. If I see my mother or my grandmother, I will recognize them how I recognize them here on earth, and they will recognize me. Okay. And look, he says, asked his views concerning the different books embraced in the Holy Bible, Dr. Buckner, who is a student of the Bible, said, I believe almost every story in the Bible is an allegory composed to illustrate some fundamental truth that could otherwise never have been clearly presented, only through the medium of an allegory. Now, I tend to agree with him on this. I believe Adam and Eve, allegory, Noah's Ark, allegory, Exodus from Egypt, allegory. I believe the majority of those stories are allegory. Now, that's not to say that he isn't a Christian, because he was a member of the AME Church, the African Methodist Church, and he was a Christian. Okay, but his views on the Bible aren't the views of a Christian who believes that it is an actual history book. The good doctor believes that almost every story in the Bible is allegory composed to illustrate some fundamental truth, which I can agree with him on that. He says, the most treacherous impulse of the human nature and the one to be most dreaded is jealousy. With those words, the aged Negro doctor launched into his expression of his political views. I'm a Democrat. He then explained how he voted for the man, but had confidence that his chosen party possesses ability in choosing proper candidates. He is an ardent follower of Franklin D. Roosevelt and speaks of Woodrow Wilson with bated breath. Now, that's interesting, because in today's world, the majority of blacks, the majority of African Americans are Democrats. But back in those days, the majority were Republicans. You understand what I'm saying? Like Abraham Lincoln wasn't a Democrat, he was a Republican. And most of the Confederate states were run by Democratic candidates. And even during the time of Reconstruction, when blacks started to rise, and then the white supremacy reared up and tried to put the Negro population back into subjection or servitude, it was the Democratic Party that did that. The majority of individuals who were pro-Confederate, they were Democrats. So it's odd to see a African American man, a Negro man during his time, be a Democrat, but he may have been on the cutting edge because the majority of us are Democrats now, right? They goes on to say, and this is what they start talking about him being an ambassador to Liberia. Check this out. Through the influence of John W. Bowie Sr. and the friendly advice of other influential citizens of Evansville, Dr. Buckner was appointed minister to Liberia on Woodrow Wilson's cabinet in the year 1913. Now, that's interesting because, look, he says, he is an ardent follower of Franklin D. Roosevelt and speaks of Woodrow Wilson with bated breath, meaning he wasn't too fond of Woodrow Wilson, but on Woodrow Wilson's cabinet, he was spoken highly of by other individuals and spoken so highly of that he was appointed the minister to Liberia or the ambassador to Liberia. Okay, and in just a second, we're going to go into some of the details about what Liberia is, and we're going to see just why that is so powerful. It goes on to say, Dr. Buckner appreciated the confidence of his friends in appointing him and cherishes the experiences gained while abroad. He noted the expressions of gratitude toward cabinet members by the citizens of the African coast. One albino youth brought an offering of luscious mangoes and desired to see the minister from the United States of America. Some natives presented palm oils. The natives have been made to understand that the United States has given aid to Liberia in a financial way, and the customs service of the Republic is temporarily administered by an American. A thoroughly civilized Negro state does not exist in Liberia, nor do I believe in any part of West Africa. Superstition is the interpretation of their religion. Their political views are a hodgepodge of unconnected ideas. Strength overrules knowledge, and jealousy crowds out almost all hope of sympathetic advancement and adjustment. Dr. Buckner recounted incidents where jealousy was apparent in the behavior of men and women of higher civilizations than the African natives. While voyaging to Spain on board a Spanish vessel, he witnessed a very refined, polite Jewish woman being reduced to tears by the taunts of a Spanish officer on account of her nationality. Jealousy, he said, protrudes itself into politics, religion, and prevents educational achievement. So when he showed up in Liberia, because he was the minister of America or the ambassador from America, he was automatically held in high regard by the citizens of that particular country. And he said that there was an albino youth that came to him with an offering of mangoes and just wanted to see him and sit down with him. And some other natives came and presented palm oils. They gave him gifts, and they presented gifts to him. And he worked as an ambassador between America and Liberia, and sought to improve their conditions. Now, he even says that the customs service of the Republic is temporarily administered by an American, indicating some American control over the goings on in Liberia. Now, Liberia is a West African country. I have it highlighted on the map to your left. So why would it be a big thing to have an ex-slave as an ambassador to Liberia? And why would the services of the Republic be temporarily administered and headed by an American? What is the connection between slaves, America, and the West African nation of Liberia? Check this out. Liberia, or the Republic of Liberia, is a country on the West African coast. It is bordered by Sierra Leone to its northwest, Guyana to its north, Ivory Coast to its east, and the Atlantic Ocean to its south and southwest. Liberia began, listen to this if you didn't already know, Liberia began in the early 19th century And the 19th century is from 1800 to 1900. So we're talking about all of the 1800s, not the 1900s. The 19th century is from 1800 to 1900. Liberia began in the early 19th century as a project of the American Colonization Society, which believed Black people would face better chances for freedom and prosperity in Africa than in the United States. Between 1822 and the outbreak of the American Civil War in 1861, more than 15,000 freed and freeborn African Americans, along with 3,198 Afro-Caribbeans, relocated to Liberia, gradually developing an Americo-Liberian identity. The settlers carried their culture and tradition with them. Liberia declared independence on July 26, 1847, while we were still enslaved on these shores, which the U.S. did not recognize until February 5th, 1862. Right smack dab in the middle of the Civil War is when America recognized Liberia as an independent nation. Liberia was the first African republic to proclaim its independence, and it's Africa's first and oldest modern republic. And if you look, you can definitely see the connections with America, even in the flag. Look at the flag: red, white, blue, star, stripes. You know what I'm saying? And Liberia, obviously the name has a ring of liberty to it, right? I don't know what language it is, but they obviously are talking about liberty. And so I often look at Liberia. I don't even want to make the connection with that war that's going on right now. But basically what happened with the American Colonization Society, they felt that the Blacks in America, since slavery was full swing, they felt that they wanted to repatriate the African American community back to Africa. So they founded the land, basically colonized, founded the nation of Liberia on the west coast of Africa, and began migrating Africans from America back to that area and forming the country that we now know as Liberia today. And even the first president of Liberia was an African American, somebody who went over there. Now, the country is mixed between natives who were never in America and the descendants of those individuals from America that went over there to Liberia. With that in mind, I always wondered why some of our actors and rappers and singers and individuals that pump money into the African continent, you know, they go to Nigeria, they go to Ghana, right? They go to Senegal, they go to different West African countries to build schools and whatnot. I always wonder why they don't go do that in Liberia, considering that Liberia was actually formed with some of our ancestors from these shores being repopulated or relocated to Africa. Why not go to Liberia, form that bond, help build up the nation of Liberia in the same manner that they're helping to build up Ghana? But you could do with your money what you want to do. Look, he says, during a political campaign, I was compelled to buy a robust Negro man to follow me about my professional visits and my social evenings with my friends and family to prevent meeting physical violence to myself or family when political factions were virtually at war within the area of Evansville. Basically saying he needed a bodyguard or a security guard to protect him. The influence of political captains had brought about the dreadful condition, and ignorant Negroes responded to their political graft without realizing who had befriended them in need. The Negro youths are especially subject to propaganda of the four-flusher, for their home influence is, to say the least, negative. Now, a four-flusher is basically a term that's talking about a con artist, right? He says their opportunities limited, their education neglected, and they are easily aroused by the meddling influence of the vote getter and the traitor. I would to God that their eyes might be open to the light. Basically saying that when slavery ended and the Negro could actually go out there and vote, there were a lot of political con men who were trying to trick the African American, trick the Negro into voting how they wanted them to vote, just to use them for their vote, when the people that they were voting for had no intention on doing anything for them. That happens even right now today. And it doesn't even just happen to the African American community. Politicians as a whole, they seem to lie to their constituents. They seem to lie to the voting public just to get the vote. And then when they get the office, they do nothing that they promised that they would do. Okay, now the Negro, when they first began to vote, they were right pickings for these scoundrels and these con men. I once read a story where to get a individual's vote, a man came to a Negro man, freely newly freed, and was like, "Hey, if you're willing to vote this way for me, then I'll move you in. I'll let you live in this shack out here on my land. I'll let you work here, and I'll pay you X amount of dollars, and I'll give you this, that, and the third." And so the Negro was like, "Oh, okay. Hey, I want somewhere to stay. I want some work. I need some money. Let's go for it." And so he went to live on this man's land. He was working for him, actually getting paid. And he cast his vote how the man wanted him to cast his vote. And as soon as the vote was cast and his political candidate won, he kicked the Negro out. And when the Negro was like, "Hey, I thought we had an understanding. If I vote this way, then you would do this for me. Why are you now kicking me out?" And the man said, "Well, if you would so easily sell your own vote, basically like sell out your own self, then somebody could come and pay you to burn my house down. So I don't trust you." Basically saying, if you'll sell out your vote for kibbles and bits, then you'll turn on me for kibbles and bits as well, right? If you'll vote against your own interest, like if you'll vote against your own interest for money, you do anything for money, even burn my house down. And so since he was like, since you so easily manipulated, since you so easily played, I played you basically. I played you. I tricked you, and I don't want nobody to play you, trick you, manipulate you to get at me. So you got to get out of here. And so that just goes to show, sometimes selling your soul is the worst thing that you can do, because if you sell your soul to someone, that person isn't going to trust you because they know that you'll sell your soul. You get what I'm saying? You sell your soul to someone, that person that you sell your soul to, they're not going to trust you. They're only going to use you, manipulate you, and abuse you because they know that you can't be trusted, because they know that you'll sell your soul. And the next highest bidder that come can get them to turn on you. So they don't want you around them. So it does you no good to sell your soul, because the person that you're selling your soul to, they're going to eventually turn on you and use you. He goes on to say, Dr. Buckner's influence is mostly exhibited in the sick room, where his presence is introduced in the effort to relieve pain. The gradual rise from slavery to prominence, the many trials encountered along the road, has ripened the always sympathetic nature of Dr. Buckner into a responsive sufferer among a suffering people. He has hope that proper influences and sympathetic advice will mold the plastic character of the Afro-American youths of the United States into proper citizens, and that their immortal souls inherit the promised reward of the freedom through and that their immortal souls inherit the promised reward of the redeemed through grace, receivers of emancipation from slavery, and enjoyers of emancipation from sin through the sacrifice of Abraham Lincoln and Jesus Christ. Why should not the Negroes be exalted and happy? Are the words of Dr. Buckner. Note, G.W. Buckner was born December 1st, 1852. The Negroes in Kentucky expressed it in fox hunting time. One brother was born in Simmon time, one in sweet tater time, and another in plantain lore. Now, real quick, hold on. In fact, let me show you guys this real quick. You see how he says receivers of emancipation from slavery and enjoyers of emancipation from sin through the sacrifice of Abraham Lincoln and Jesus Christ. He mentions Abraham Lincoln and Jesus Christ in the same breath, talking about emancipation from slavery and emancipation from sin. That's interesting, because nowadays, when we look at the historical record, we all have a head knowledge and an understanding that Abraham Lincoln clearly said if he could save the Union without freeing any slaves, he would do it. And his motive in the Civil War was to preserve the Union. It was not necessarily to free the slaves. So we know that, right? We know that today. And even in today's time, we don't hold Abraham Lincoln. A lot of us don't hold of the African-American population. A lot of us of the African-American population don't hold Abraham Lincoln up in high regards, because our head knowledge tells us, hey, he really didn't even want to free our ancestors. He just did it to win the war. But when we look back into history, well, what I want you to understand is our ancestors indubitably saw him as a savior figure. Why? Because they actually lived through the horrors of slavery. It's one thing to, live your whole life in freedom, right? Live your whole life in freedom, decades removed, right? Over a century removed from the horrors of slavery. And to look back and be like, oh man, Abraham Lincoln ain't do nothing. I don't really gotta respect Abraham Lincoln. He ain't even want to free the slave. But it's a whole other thing to put yourself in the position of the enslaved. Our ancestors was actually on those plantations. And then for whatever reason, right? For whatever reason, Abraham Lincoln signed that Emancipation Proclamation. He did it. And with the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, many of our ancestors gained their freedom. And so regardless of what he was feeling in his heart or what he said out of his mouth at that time, that stayed from going from enslaved to free, right? With the stroke of a pen and the fighting of a war, but with that stroke of a pen was monumental. So me personally, I understand what Abraham Lincoln did. I'm always going to tell the truth about what he did. I'm always going to tell the truth about what he said, but I'll never take away from his impact to my ancestors. And I'll never negate how my ancestors saw him. They saw him as a savior figure. And here you even see he's putting the same breath with Jesus Christ as far as when you're talking about savior figures. So with that being said, in this episode on Matthew Daniels TV, we have been looking into the Indiana slave narratives, the oral history of our ancestors, and we have been taking a look at Dr. George Washington Buckner, a slave, a doctor, an American ambassador to Liberia. If you want to support the channel, cash out The Real Bookworm. It's on the screen. Drop $1 or $2, or go to Amazon.com. Look up Suicide Note by Matthew Daniels. I'm an author. I'm a scribe. I've written 16 books. But instead of trying to hunt down all 16 books, I want you to look up Suicide Note by Matthew Daniels and purchase a copy of that book. And I would greatly appreciate it. And that will be all the support I need getting my written works out there to the public. As always, I hope you guys heard something that you never heard before. I hope you guys learned something about your history on these shores that you never knew. And I hope you appreciate the time that I took to put this together. I'm your brother, Matthew Daniels, a.k.a. I'm Pooh, a.k.a. The Chosen Few, a.k.a. The Real Bookworm. I'm not just a bookworm world. I am the real bookworm. Make sure you get it right. And as always, may your name live on forever, and may your memory never die. Hotel, I'm out.